Oke, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We are
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
we are from four group from second grade high school. We will bring a material about writing course material for the word a great compromise. Let me introduce our member. They are first is Muhammad Tariq Fauzan, second is Emil Meilani, third is Putri Nabila, four is Bisma Chakra, and five is Tasya Sivana. Okay, we will enter the first material will be delivered by Muhammad Tariq. Please.
I'm sorry. Check. Okay, thanks to moderator who has given me a chance to explain the material. We begin with introduction. First, the focus of this chapter is on that process of modification and whether the inevitability of compromise is a positive or negative force upon the writer's pedagogic principle. So this chapter is the of the modification which compromise about a positive or negative upon the writer's pedagogic principle. Okay, next, please. Course book in general confronting the issues. These are some of the more important ones. If one of your pedagogic principles is that creativity is important in the classroom, then how can you make sure that your course book do not take away investment in and responsibility for learning from teachers and learners? If course books are sometimes used by school to maintain consistency of syllabus, how can you at the same time make sure they reflect the dynamic and interactive nature of the learning process? Although it is true a course book can cater for all the individual needs of all learners all of the time. Can you provide enough material to meet most of the needs most of the time and build in enough flexibility to enable teachers to individualize it? Okay, next, please. Okay. The next is the notion of compromise. This is a reasonable approach. Indeed, it prevents the illusion that situation-specific materials can do the job without the teacher having to adapt the materials to a particular group of individual students.
Itu udah masuk materinya email, Tor.
Iya. Ini udah masuk materi email ya?
Iya.
Ya wes satu kalau gitu mah nggak apa-apa lah.
Paling nanti
di-cut aja ya.
Di-cut.
Semangat ting.
Diam salah.
Udah
langsung aja ya, aku tutup.
Kamu thank you aja gitu, thank you.
Langsung aku tutup ya. Nanti tinggal dipotong. Yo, that's enough from me. I give you back to moderator.
Okay, thank you for Tariq for delivering the material. Okay, the next material will be delivered by Email Mainland, please.
Okay, thank you to moderator. Now I will explain about the notion of compromise. This is a reasonable approach. Indeed, it prevents the illusion that situation-specific materials can do the job without the teacher having to adapt the materials to a particular group of individual students at a particular time. So, with international materials, it is obvious that the needs of individual students and teachers, as well as the expectation of particular schools in particular countries, can never be fully met by the material themselves. Okay. Indeed, most users seem to accept that what they choose will in many ways be a compromise and that they will have to adapt the materials to their situation. Okay, the second one is the publisher compromise. One of Headway's success when it was first published all those years ago was that it reverted to a familiar grammatical syllabus when many other course books were considered to have become too functionally oriented. The sensible balance, a compromise of party principle will surely be between innovation and conservatism. A blend of the new and different with the reasonably familiar. So, compromise is not just something that is shared by user. Publisher also compromise otherwise they would not get the material they want they, that this is material that they cannot only be proud of when exhibiting against other publisher but which sell because potential user want to use it. That's all for me. I have been bring back to moderator.
Okay, thank you for email. Okay, the next material will be presented by myself. It's about the author. Okay, please the next slide. Okay, the author. The author find themselves comparison and indeed they often feel themselves comparison by publisher. Particularly author who is the experienced teacher with a strong conviction and how learners learn best. A publisher who done a little real research of their own release on the author's experience and then later tell them they not put their ideas into the practice. But teachers who are the author also have to compromise. Their teaching experience is often different of many intended use their ideas might not work in the majority of the classroom. So author is who are not teacher also have a confirmation. So they have considerate something. And the first is beware of being too much the teacher trainer and look also at that student one rather than concentrate on the new ideas of the teachers. And then second is balance of activity and skill is necessary and where there is often one eye on uh, recycling and revision. And then the material has to fit on the page so that student can actually find themselves compressing and have a compromise force upon them. Okay, next slide. Okay, and the next slide is a case of an anecdotal and talk about our own experience of when we were asked to writer the first level in that was to become credible to grave course series. It was an intermediate level course for adult students both in the UK, 15 until 21 hours a week, and private school offers 2 until 3 hours a week. The assumption is that the teacher will have experience in organizing communicative activity in the classroom, work with a text, develop reading and a listening skill, and be able to use textbook flexible. Of course, we accept that the material may be used by a less experienced teacher. So, however, the brief itself indicates a need for compromise. First is the multilingual intensive in UK situation and the monolingual far less intensive situation are as we have already seen not the same. And the second is monolingual situation differ. And then the third is the material was still likely to be used by less trained, untrained, or different trained teacher. And then four, it was likely that the material will be chosen by some school when it is inappropriate for their situation and the use by learners who are too young to identify with the cultural content of the material. And five is it was likely that the material will be used in some school where the language syllabus and indeed the whole program of the study are planned by the course book. Okay, the next material will be delivered by Bisma Chakra. Bisma Chakra, please.
Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. The next material is the principle. We decide on the set of this principle. We have many principle in this chapter, but I just explain to you just for principle. The first is flexibility. We want an activity sequence that work pedagogically, but it's one important that teachers should feel that could move activity around, cut them out or supplement them according to need, all of which we made clear in the teacher's book. In other words, we want to produce a coursebook with a strong research book element. Indeed, we saw the workbook as the potential extra classroom resource for the teacher as well as a self-study book. And second is from the language. Because of the need of intermediate student, we want to provide authentic texts which contain example of the focus language rather than construct text of our own. Language in a global context, we called it, and we hope we could draw language work out of the text. The third is engaging content. Engaging content. We want to provide human interest text which, although they come from a British or natural content, would stimulate the student to make cultural and personal comparison. We want the text to engage the student personally. At the same time, we want them to be used as a research for language and as the basis for speaking and writing. We feel that some of the book could be serious in tone, but not too many. Will quite a lot of students, some researchers in everyday topics such as money, relationship, classes, and food. Far fewer students in general language classroom were interested in the worded topic to be found in The Guardian. Of course, having said that, there are some part of the world that would find only the serious topic appropriate for their student. There needed to be a balance of serious and fun article. It goes without saying that, like all global coursebook writer, we were also constrained by cultural sensitivities, so that there could be no or only very oblique and upbeat references to sex, drug, death, politics, and religion. It was clearly more sensitive to leave the discussion, to use this topic to the individual teacher and their particular circumstance. And the last is professional respect. We want to product something that gave us professional satisfaction and was academically credible to our colleagues. Something we could be proud of. We also want a course that applied adult and sophisticated with a clean look about it. And the next is about pressures. Next. We have four for pressures. The first is from the publisher. The publisher were encouraging and allowed us a lot of creative freedom. So many of our aspiration and also want something that would give them academic credibility as well as healthy cells. Nevertheless, they had an A on market. They had to sell and did not want spiraling production costs. And the second pressure from school and institution. Institution need nevertheless impose perfectly proper constraint on our writing. The material should not be inappropriate to the content. The topic should be interesting to their student. The material should not that too much. It should be user-friendly. It should be usable alongside and sometimes integrate with other material and should enable students to make rapid progress. On the production side, it should be good quality, but cheap and all component, coursebook, workbook, tabs, teacher book should be available locally on lunch. And the third from the teacher. We felt teacher wants a book they called sympathies with in them of its pedagogy principle that would need to have a fresh and original feel to it and yet be reassuring, familiar. And since teachers have a lot of demand on their time, they would need it to fulfill certain criteria, not too much preparation, usable and motivating material, fun activity that work in terms of improving the student communicative skill, transparent methodology, upfront grammar, and flexible approach which allow teacher to use the material more as a research than a principal course. And the last is from student. Student would want material that they could enjoy and which they could identify with and learn from. Language needed to be comprehensible, but there did need to be new language there on the page. They needed a lot of revision, a lot of material they could use to study on their own. They needed supplementary material such as workbooks. Okay, maybe that's enough for me. I'm going back to the moderator.
Okay, thank you for Bisma. And then the next material will be delivered by Tasya Sivana. Tasya, please.
Next, please. Okay, so the last material is about principle and compromise. With all the factors that have been explained before by the previous presenter, it is not surprising that the issues of compromise was the central of the writer's work. It is surprising how many the previous grand principles more or less survive. So, according to the case, there are 5 main areas of compromise. The first one, here we have overall structure. So the compromise that were met with some complaints from user, and the writers have had to provide extra material in the teacher's book in later editions. So in the case, the writers found some trouble when they arranged the course book. At the time, it was clear that the idea of a flexible course book was not fully understood by the potential users. The writers were aware from the initial feedback that some teachers felt they had to cover everything in the book in order presented. This could happen because at that time, the writer's idea of using workbook as part of classroom research was not universally accepted since many students didn't have access to the workbook. At that time, the writers were not sufficiently aware of the potential of the teacher's book. They wanted to start the book with a deep end approach, but many market or target didn't like or understand this approach and wanted a straightforward presentation of the main language item. And the other problem was lack of space. The space here is the space of work. It caused them great frustration and at the editing stage when they saw many of their practice activities disappear or get burned. So the compromise that were made that time are met with some complaints from user, and the writers have had to provide extra material in the teacher's action. And then the second, we have methodology. We should have compromised more by having fewer exercises that were not very popular in some parts. So at that time, the writer faced some difficulties, like their original ambition to draw target language out of authentic text is failed at the intermediate level. It could be because of the difficulty of finding text which contain clear example of the focus language together with interesting content. And for their approach to grammar, the approach was seen to be too serious and expect too much from students. So writers conclude that they should have compromised more by having fewer such exercise. And then the third, here we have text. The compromise was one of logistic, publisher pressure, and student expectation, as well as our own greater realization that some of our initial ambition were unrealistic. In the situation at that time, the writers resisted publisher pressure to make their text more intellectual, but it was clear that there were going to be problems with unadapted authentic text. So they were made compromise and choose which text were more interesting to be used. They also want their listening to be natural and as authentic as possible. And they conclude that maybe they should have made more of them semi-scripted and build it in more how to listen tests. And then the main areas of compromise, the fourth, here we have content. We did compromise and not include some text we would have used in our own students on the ground that they would not go down well in such and such a country. So in terms of content, the writers realized that they couldn't please anyone. So they make compromise and not include some text that they would have used in their own student on the ground that they would not go down well in several parts of the world. In other words, the writers decide to do this because maybe if some content apply to certain place or country, it could lead pro and contra, for example, like sex education, politics, and debate, etc. and etc. And then the last, here we have piloting. For the final edition, direct piloting was difficult if schedules and budget were to be met. We relied more on our own experience and the experience of advisor. So at the time, there are many plus and minus for the pilot edition of the material, such as there were a pilot edition which proved to be good training for the writers, but most of the material didn't get used except in part of the workbook. And then the process helped the writer's thinking, but not all the feedback was helpful as the writers hoped. So this mainly because it was often contradictory, which means that the writers conclude that direct piloting was difficult if schedule and budget were to be. So the writers compromised to realize more on their own experience and experience of advisors. Okay, maybe that's all of me. I'll bring it back to the moderator.
Okay, thank you for Tasha who delivered the last material. Okay, all the material have been delivered about writing course material for the word a great compromise. Okay, that's all from us. Thank you for your attention. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi
wabarakatuh.
wabarakatuh.